So I want to acknowledge something, and I try to pay attention to big trends, to drastic changes in the way observant Jews do things, because I think we often have a lot to learn from them. I think very, very often when we talk about massive changes affecting large, groups of the Jewish community, we often speak of them lamentably, like so many people are da-da-da-da-da-da, this has become super popular, it's breaking with tradition, it's, how did this happen, etc. I think that's a common rhetoric that you often hear. But, what we're doing today, and what you've been, what we're all participating in by being here, is also a relatively recent trend. I would argue the following. Up until the 1960s, Tish'a BeAb looked the following way. You went to synagogue, you stayed in synagogue, you went home, you rested, you came back to synagogue, and then the fast was over. Exactly. There was depending on what community you belonged to, there was a varying amount of text that was read in the synagogue. But for all intents and purposes, texts were read as prayers. You went home, you rested, you came back to finish praying and finish off the day. That's what structurally, ritually, that's what Yom Kippur looked like. Sorry, that's what Tish'a BeAb looked like. One man altered that entire picture for the whole Jewish world, from the Reform Jews all the way to Lakewood. And that man was Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik. By extension, his student, Rabbi Ezra Labaton, made that change in the Sephardic world. And it started in Deal, by the way, and it spread. It's ironic that if you look at the core texts, what do I mean by the core texts? I mean Talmud, Rambam, Shulchan Aruch, the codes of Jewish law. Torah study is prohibited on Tish'a BeAb. 2 years ago, actually I was sitting next to you and your father-in-law, I attended a shiur by Rabbi Ricky Hidary just across the hall on Tish'a BeAb that would go on to inspire a series that I would then teach in the fall, and it would last some time on the book of Eov. I attended the shiur and I came away completely mind blown. Okay? And that's a very important point, because when Talmud prohibits Talmud Torah on Tish'a BeAb, part of the question is why, and can we come away from it with some lessons based on the why, the answer why. And it's very, very important. So, first and foremost, there's a reason why Torah study is prohibited on Tish'a BeAb that doesn't necessarily answer the underlying reason. But the initial why, the surface why, is because Tish'a BeAb is meant to mimic a mourning process, specifically the Shiv'ah, and on a Shiv'ah, Torah study is prohibited. Okay? And that takes me to source 1, Tanu Rabbanan, our sages taught, Ve'elu devarim she'avel asur bahen. These are the things that an avel is prohibited to do on Tish'a BeAb. Asur be'melacha, it's prohibited to engage in melacha, in what we call work, uberechitza, bathing, ubesiha, caring for his skin, ubetashmish hamita, marital relations, ubena'ilata sandal, wearing proper shoes, which we refer to today as leather-bound shoes, ve'asur likro batorah, and it is prohibited to study the Torah, nevi'im, ketuvin, and leshanot ba Mishnah, and to engage in the study of Mishnah, bamidrash, bahalakha, ubatalmud, ubaagadot. Now, what that sentence really is a sum total of all that would be considered Torah. Okay? So a mourner is barred from the study of all that would be considered Torah, and this is codified in Harambam in almost identical terminology, and it is replicated in Masechet Ta'anit in likewise almost identical terminology, but the reference is to fasts. Tanu Rabbanan, Kol hamitzvot hanohagot be'avel, all of the commandments that pertain to a person in mourning, nohagot beTish'a BeAb, are practiced on Tish'a BeAb as well. Asur be'achila, in addition, a mourner is allowed to eat. But it is prohibited to eat, to drink, and all those other things that a mourner is prohibited to do. So, sicha, ne'ilat hasandal, tashmish hamita, exactly as it's presented in Masechet Moed Katan. Come in. Ve'asur likrot ba'Torah, ba'nevi'im, u'ba'ketuvim. Exactly, word for word, vowel to vowel, verbatim. It is prohibited to read from the Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, and to study the Mishnah, Talmud, Midrash, the laws, and the Agadot. And then there's an asterisk. But this is a very, very, very important asterisk. Aval, however, Korehu, Bimkom she'eno ragil likrot. One opinion says it is permissible to read from texts that one does not have the typical habit of reading from. And it is permissible to study from rabbinic texts, Mishnah, etc., that one does not have the habit of reading from. And one can read the texts of Kinot, which is just, in Talmudic terminology, just a reference to Megillat Echa, the book of Echa, Ube Iyov, and in the book of Iyov, Ubidvarim Hara'im Shebeyirmiyah, and in the tragic events described in the book of Yirmiyah. And furthermore, Tinokot Shel Bet Rabban Betelin, the children must interrupt their studies. Okay, that means school is off. Because the pasuk says, Pekudei Adonai Yesharim Mesamehe Lev. The structures, commandments, laws, statements of God are straight and bring joy to the human heart. Now, there's a question. Was that an explanation for the whole Mishnah or just that last statement? Is it that the students shouldn't because of this? Or, and also the students shouldn't? And all of the above is true because of the following. Pekudei Adonai Yesharim Mesamehe Lev. By the way, why is that very, very important? Because what I said 2 years ago, I attended a shi'ur that was taught right across the hall from this room. It was technically under the category of items that one can study on Tish'a BeAb. But it brought me joy. I was delighted.
Maybe it's because you usually not that specific topic, but one of the exceptions was if you don't usually study that. So maybe for us, we don't usually study these, but for the rabbi.
So Rabbi Yehuda Omer, first of all, ultimately that last final statement doesn't emerge as conclusive. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda says, Af eno kore b'makom she'eno ragil. That category of things that you wouldn't normally teach yourself, exclude that one too. That one doesn't work either.
For me, that's a large chunk of.
So it's speaking to the scholar, and it's saying to the scholar, you know, En adam lamed elav ma shelibo hafetz. It's typical for a scholar to direct the majority of their learning to that which their heart desires. Okay? It's typical that you just wiggle to a place at some point in your learning where you really zero in on those things that bring you joy. It's like that with anything. So for Tish'a BeAb, if you direct your studies to the more tedious, less heartening, or simply to that which doesn't typically bring you joy, to that which you typically wouldn't gravitate toward, that would render it acceptable. Okay? But again, ultimately, that position is rejected as well. I suspect that the reason why it's rejected is because you'd be surprised how many things will ultimately bring you joy. Right? You cannot for certain assume that it won't bring you joy because it's not something you would typically study. You'd be surprised that ultimately it would bring you joy. And that would then retroactively make it inappropriate. How do I know? Because look at how they define the chapters of Yirmiyah. You're really only supposed to do the Dvarim Hara'im. And if you happen upon words of consolation and positive prophecy in the book of Yirmiyah, the expectation is to skip over it. So maybe likro b'dvarim she'eno ragil likro b'hem is acceptable for starters, but if you find over the course of your study that it brings you joy, you probably should stop. Okay?
I think it's an like the whole thing is an oxymoron because for people to willingly come somewhere, it's with the expectation that there would be some benefit and joy to be had. Or else you wouldn't be difficult to park.
There are other ways to phrase that, first of all. That it's not about joy per se, but it's about introspection, it's about self-discovery, it's about connection. And if directed appropriately, it's about connection to those things where your soul wishes you had more, but you don't. And so in the absence of food and in the absence of other distractions, you have time to reconnect with the part of you that yearns. And I wouldn't necessarily refer to that as joy, though it can be exhilarating, right? But that's already like jumping the gun. But there are two very clear perspectives here. One is the position of Rabbeinu Hananel, and he says in clear terms that when it's something that you gravitate towards, it brings you joy. When it's something you wouldn't typically gravitate toward, there is some distaste in it. Maharasha says, at the end of the day, one cannot ignore the description, the adjective, mesamehe lev, that which brings joy to the heart. However, I am of the position, he says, delav mishum simcha, nagauba. This is not about simcha. This isn't about what brings you joy. In fact, that pasuk of mesamehe lev refers to children and was brought in because of that last clause about children. Aval b'shar kol adam, but as it pertains to adults, ta'ama achrina, there is another reason. Mishum shelo yishkach evelo shel yom. One is not supposed to distract themselves from the implicit mourning that is part and parcel of the day. And this is very, very important, essential, because it characterizes how one is to study even those things which are permitted to study.
You have to relate it to the day.
The year was 2013. And I was taking summer classes at Torah. And so I stayed in New York for the summer, and I did Tish'a BeAb in the Bet Midrash that Torah has in Queens, where I was getting my semicha at the time and where I was also dorming. And I remember it was Leil Tish'a BeAb, and these two students were studying the laws of Avelut, which is included in the list of things which one is allowed to study. But it appeared to me as though they were studying it the way they would study the laws of Shabbat, the way they would study any other laws in the Gemara. Their tone matched their tone throughout the year. Their body language matched their body language throughout the year. For all intents and purposes, they were so engrossed, they didn't have to think about food. They didn't have to think about back pain if they were sitting on the floor. They didn't have to think about anything. Why? Because they had achieved the fluid flow that Torah study creates, but the subject matter happened to be the laws of mourning. I think that's what's not allowed. That's what all of these laws are telling us not to do.
Almost like it was mundane. It was just the regular.
It was the regular way. And the regular way is a very engaging process. I'd venture to say that by emerging from that shiur in 2019, I'm not blaming it on the lecturer. I'll blame it on myself. But I negated what these laws are trying to achieve. Now I'm taking a completely different approach in my conclusion, but at this moment in time, absorbing fully these prohibitions, that's the conclusion that I would emerge with. Okay? So when you study the Kinot, which is the book of Echa, that which is referred to as Kinot, that is post Echa, the poems of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, Betzeti Mimitzrayim, Betzeti Mirushalayim, and all of that, those are addenda that were added in the Middle Ages. But yes, Kinot, that is referred to in Talmud, is just the book of Echa. And if you study the bad things of Yirmiyah, and if you study the Midrashim of Echa, and by extension, if you study the book of Iyov, it is automatic that you will come to keep the Bet HaMikdash, its destruction, and the calamities that have faced the Jewish people in your hearts. So that is to say, one could formulate this prohibition in two ways. One could say Torah study is not prohibited on Tish'a BeAb because there are exceptions to the rule. And not a small category of exceptions, a lot of exceptions to the rule. And all of those exceptions fit within the larger category of Torah. And so if those are permitted on Tish'a BeAb, then Torah study is not prohibited on Tish'a BeAb. It's just Torah study, which keeps you zeroed in on the content of the day, is permitted. Torah study, which does not, is prohibited. There is another approach, which is Torah study is prohibited on Tish'a BeAb. Like Torah study is prohibited for an Avel, in mourning. After all, that is how the Mishnah in Ta'anit replicates itself. Those things which are permitted on Tish'a BeAb are permitted not as Talmud Torah per se. One could even say that they're permitted as forms of tefillah. They are to be studied and to be recited not in the way that the rest of Torah is to be studied and recited, because they are not meant to create mesamech halev, which Torah as a category creates. They are to be read the way we read Echa in the synagogue. If you can imagine. That is to say, we read it. We even read it and expound upon its words. But it's not an act of study, that is to say, exploration, arrival at novel conclusions, emerging with an understanding of the text that we previously hadn't had, the way that we would think of Torah, which is lamed davar mitoch davar, extrapolation and study and emergence. But rather, it is to be said like a prayer, like a meditation. I read and reread these words because these words take me to a certain place.
The thing with this is beyond Avelu, because I could have the yortzeit, someone could have a yortzeit of a parent, and that day, the yortzeit, a year later or 2 years later, they can go to a wedding and dance.
100%. Tish'a BeAb doesn't grant us that. Tish'a BeAb does not grant us that. It forces us to re-adopt the status of Shiv'ah one day a year. So that if the ban on Talmud Torah really is meant to replicate, then we're emerging with some kind of an understanding that's, well, that raises a question, yeah.
Is the text that describes the prohibition on Talmud Torah, Tish'a BeAb, is it similar to the text that's used for prohibition to Talmud Torah in Avelu?
Identical. It's actually identical. It's word for word identical.
So how do you explain? I've been to people sitting shiva where like the rabbi comes and gives a Dvar Torah.
It's a great question.
Generally not. Is that not?
The rabbi is not directing his attention to the mourners. The rabbi is directing his attention to those who are responding Kaddish.
Right. Who are there in the minyan?
In that setting, in that scenario. Okay? Yeah. Furthermore, Shulchan Aruch codifies all of this. And he says that if in any of these texts there are words of nehama, one skips over them. I said that already. So this brings us to a little bit of a crisis, I think. Right? I mean, here you had a practice that was really born in the 60s and that really started to spread to the larger Jewish world in the 70s, 80s, and has become really colossal today. And by the way, I mean, it is across the Jewish world, regardless of levels of observance, events take place on Tish'a BeAb that look exactly like this. Taught by people who could recite these sources verbatim. Right? And I think that is not insignificant. There is a teaching in the Talmud Yerushalmi. It's a story that actually is not meant to have much to do with Tish'a BeAb. It has to do with Talmud Torah and Shabbat and a practice that existed in Talmudic times that banned the study of certain types of Torah on Shabbat in the afternoon because it had become widespread that the people of Israel living in the diaspora were becoming more and more ignorant of Halakha. And they labored very intensively during the week. So that barred any opportunity for study during the week. And so Shabbat afternoons became a time when derashot were given in synagogue settings. And the derasha specifically pertained to matters of halakha. That which one should do, that which one should not do, and why. Okay? In that context, they banned the study of ketuvim. That is the book of Daniel, the book of Echa, the book of Esther, the book of Shir HaShirim, the book of Ruth, Mishle, Tehillim. Okay, Tehillim was banned on Shabbat afternoons, believe it or not. So that the people will attend the derasha, so that they have a solid understanding of Halakha. And the response is, because in the land of Israel people spoke Hebrew, so the stories of the Tanakh were accessible to the people on their own. But the laws were not accessible to the people. They required a more profound form of study. You didn't have these, Rambam, Mishneh Torah in English, Shulchan Aruch in English, which is pretty straightforward and to the T. Right? It was Talmudic law at the time in all of its disorganization. And Talmudic law needed to be taught and disseminated to the people. And they needed a medium. They needed a Hacham to serve as the medium. And it was decreed across Jewish communities in Eretz Israel that you had to, if you were a male past a certain age, Shabbat afternoon, you had to attend the derasha. Because otherwise, you wouldn't be able to participate in community affairs because you wouldn't know what the standards of community affairs were as far as ritual is concerned. Fascinating. In that context, the story is told. Okay. Rabbi, ורבי חייא, ורבי ישמעאל, בן רבי יוסי, היו יושבים ופושטין במגילת קינות. ערב תשעה באב שחל להיות בשבת, מן המנחה ולמעלה. It was ערב תשעה באב that fell out on a Shabbat, just like yesterday. And it was מן המנחה ולמעלה. It was the latter half of the day, at a time when people are not supposed to be studying Ketubim. V'shiyeruba aleph bet achat. And they ended their studies with one set of aleph bet left to the book, which either means the 4th chapter or the 5th chapter of Echa. If it means aleph bet literally, it's the 4th chapter of the book of Echa, the last of the chronological order chapters. And if it's not literal, the 5th chapter, Zechor Adonai Mahayalanu, is also a 22-verse chapter, which is not structured in aleph bet order, but contains the whole of the aleph bet. So it could very well be that they had only left the 5th chapter behind. But either way, they didn't finish their studies. Now, all of this is a counter-argument, by the way, to say that this would be permissible, since after all they were doing it. But something happens. There's a twist to the plot, which is really fascinating. Amru, lemachar anu ba'im vegomrin ota. Tomorrow, we will come and finish it off. Tomorrow on Tish'a BeAb, we will come and finish it off. Now, what is implied in we will come and finish it off? And it's more than that you read it the way we would read it in synagogue. You are allowed to engage in the profound study of it the way these great scholars, Rabbi Xiya, and Rabbi Ishmael ben Rabbi Yoseh, would get together to study it together, the trio. Right? And you can imagine what happens when these guys get into a room and start to study together. I mean, these are co-authors of the whole Talmudic body. Their names are essential. There is no Talmud without these 3 characters. And so you could only imagine what happens when they get into a room and start learning together. And they take it upon themselves to get back together tomorrow on Tish'a BeAb and to continue this study. Okay? From there I would learn that all of this would then be permitted. That it's not that all of Torah is banned. And those things which are permitted ought to be studied in a manner that is not what we would call Torah, the way we would envision it by an Avel. But rather, Torah is permitted. Most of Torah, which brings joy and distraction, should be banned. But those segments of Torah which direct our attention to Tish'a BeAb should remain permitted, and those should be studied. This seems to be telling us that that's how I can walk away and we're spared. Except that, on his way home, as he was heading home, nichshal be'etzba'o. Rabbi, as he departed from the group and went on his way home, he stubbed his toe. Ve'kara al grameh, and he recited the following verse over what had just happened to him. Rabim mach'ovim larasha. Many ills will befall the rasha. That is to say, for planning to get back and doing what I'm doing now on Tish'a BeAb, I stubbed my toe. God was telling me that's not appropriate. Or maybe it's for going against the dictum of studying Ketuvim on Shabbat. Even though I'm a great sage who knows the halachot, I can even teach the halachot. In fact, I even do teach the halachot. But I went against the ban on the study of Ketuvim on Shabbat afternoon. Maybe that's why I'm being punished. Right? Or maybe it's none of the above. Maybe it's from walking away from the Beit HaMidrash with my text unfinished. But one position would say it's for taking upon myself to engage in profound study on Tish'a BeAb. Amar le Rabbi Haya behovenu. It's our fault that this happened to you. Tichtiv ruach apenu Mashiach Adonai nilkad bishchitotam. Which means that people at times get caught up in the nets that ensnared in the nets that they set themselves. And Rabbi Ishmael ben Rabbi Yosef finally chimed into the conversation and said, "Ilu lo hayinu oskin ba'inyan, kach haya lanu lomar. Alahat kama v'chama shehayinu oskin ba'inyan." Guys, what are we talking about here? We're talking about Talmud Torah. Okay? If we hadn't been studying Torah, it would be one thing to say all of this. But we were studying Torah. Now we could be better. Of course we could be better. And we should apply all of these verses to ourselves nonetheless. But we were studying Torah. And I think that perspective is the most important one. Because we can't lose sight of the fact of what it is that we're talking about here. Yes, we're talking about something that is prohibited. But of all the things in the world that are prohibited, we're talking about the study of Torah here. Right? And that's not insignificant. Because if you go back to that original statement about the Avel, not the one about the fast days, about the mourner, there is an asterisk there too. And it could be read in one of two ways. I have it on my phone.
The rabbis of the Gemara discuss why interpreting why he said that about stubbing his toe, between all the different ideas.
There's very little commentary on the Yerushalmi itself, so there's very little external commentary, and then within the Gemara itself, it goes back to the topic of Shabbat, which is, I learned 3 things. Oh, he goes home and he places a bandage on his finger. And so we learned 3 things. One of the things is about Ketuvim. The other one is about that you're allowed to put a bandage on your finger on Shabbat. And then there's a third item. So it just kind of goes back to, which is, again, when we speak of Talmud as sort of disorganized, I think that's often what's referred to, right? You go into a topic, but it's a tangent, and you explore it in detail, and then you go back, and that tangent is left with so many unanswered questions, and then what? Well, listen to the following. It is prohibited to read Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, and to study Mishnah, and Midrash, and Halakha, etc. However, if the public needed law is the subject, but there are 2 candidates for who law is referring to. Law may be referring to the teacher. If a teacher is sitting in his shiva and the public needs the teacher, then despite the fact that he's sitting in shiva, he can get up and teach. And in fact, Rabbi Yosef, who's Rabbi Yosef? The father of Rabbi Yishmael ben Rabbi Yosef. Okay? His son died. And we don't know if it's Rabbi Yishmael. But we do know that Rabbi Yishmael is one of the, well, there's multiple Rabbi Yishmaels. There's a Rabbi Yishmael who was a martyr, one of the Asara Harugei Malchut, one of the martyrs of Rome. But Rabbi Yosef lost a son. And during his Shiva, he entered into the Bet Midrash and he taught the students all day long. That's one approach to tzerichin law, who need law. The other approach is, if the public needs the Torah, right? Not necessarily that the public needs the teacher, but the public needs the Torah. And the person who's sitting Shiva is the person who can deliver that Torah. But the public needs the Torah. Right? And so I'm going to say something homiletically here. Because the public was never banned from Talmud Torah in the first place. It was the teacher who was. But if the public needs Torah, then even though an individual is banned from the study of Torah, that individual has the right to engage in the study of Torah for the public's sake. And homiletically, I could certainly say about all of us, we are a public that needs Torah. And so though we may, by the letter of the law, be banned from the study of certain segments of the Torah, we are a public that needs the Torah. And so as individuals, we have the right to pursue it for the public's sake. Okay? That's one approach.
Can you say that about any generation, that the public needs the Torah?
I
You
think,
always say that.
I think if something came to be, and it came to be widely adopted across denominations and across communities, I think there needs to be a limud zechut, and I think we can speak of our generation in terms that we speak of no previous generation, because in fact, as a human civilization, from the Industrial Revolution onward, we're dealing with a different species that can produce in different quantities, that can engage on different levels, that could communicate in different ways, that can live a different lifespan, literally. And so we speak of the 20th century onwards as a different generation. It is a different generation. It's operating in terms that no previous generation, in terms far drastically different than any that any previous generation ever had to deal with. It's just different. So that's one approach. And that's what I call the limud zechut approach. But I think that there is another approach. Okay? And again, correct my understanding of history. But I really do believe that Rabbi Labaton created what we have here, and it came from his teacher, Rabbi Soloveitchik. And I believe that prior to the 1960s, what we are seeing here wasn't happening. It really was the product of his doing. Now, what did he do exactly? He was a scholarly person in Western literature. In addition to being a tremendous Talmid Hacham, the Kinot of Ashkenaz. You see, there is a whole tradition of Kinot that was born in 11th century Ashkenaz in the aftermath of the Crusades. And even prior to that, actually, in 8th century Ashkenaz, it's disputed, but a man named Rabbi Elazar HaKalir wrote the most obscure poetry that never really made its way across the Mediterranean. And the combination of those two categories make it that the Ashkenazic Kinot service is significantly longer. Amongst Faradim, you have to distinguish between expulsees of Spain and non-expulsees of Spain. The expulsees of Spain brought a literary tradition of the golden age of Spanish Jewry with them, and many of those communities in Morocco and in Egypt, they took on a post-15th century liturgy that specifically commemorated the Crusades. But either way, what was happening was he was analyzing these texts in the English language and extrapolating from them. And these texts really did not belong to any of those categories in the Mishnah. They're unique. They're a form of poetry. But over the years, it expanded further. And to understand one text, you cite a Gemara. And to understand the Gemara, you cite contextual sources, until what emerges is an act of Talmud Torah. One that spread all over. And so today, in some communities, like in the Lakewood world, what's commonly said is we wait until Chatzot to study these things. Before Chatzot, we really just read Kinot. After Chatzot, we can do these types of shiurim as a means of compromise. But it really starts then, and it starts in that way. And I think there's something else that can be said. And I think it's best described in a volume that was published that printed out the teachings of Rabbi Soloveitchik on the Kinot in the introduction to that volume. And you actually have a link to it in the document if you'd like to read it afterwards. And this is by Rabbi Haskell Lookstein. This article was written by Rabbi Haskell Lookstein. And this was a trip that Rabbi Lookstein took to Israel in the aftermath of the 6-Day War. And I want to read to you, because I think that there's something else at play that redefines Tish'a BeAb in our generation. We arrived in Tel Aviv on Erev Tish'a BeAb, August 14th, 1967, just in time to eat a meal before the fast and go to Rabbi Shlomo Goren's synagogue for Tish'a BeAb night service. The mood in Israel was anything but Tish'a BeAb like. There was simply no feeling of mourning or sadness. On the contrary, there's a feeling of exhilaration, confidence, excitement, and redemption. It was clear that Israelis were in no mood to observe or even feel the sadness and mourning of Tish'a BeAb. The service proceeded rather routinely. Rabbi Goren read Echa, and then the congregation began the first of the Lamentations. They got through about half of the stanzas, and then they stopped, and everybody proceeded to leave the synagogue. The mood of the country was one of liberation and redemption, with people feeling that they had been saved from, God forbid, a second Holocaust, and a sensation that we were not only we were saved, but the state of Israel had expanded its territory, etc. Okay?
How long was this after the
This
war?
was a month and a half after the war. Okay? But it's not about how long it was after the war. It's about something else entirely. How was Tish'a BeAb commemorated in the Second Temple era? So we know, no, there were no distinct korbanot that were brought. Korbanot have to be from the Torah. They can't be addended from the biblical dictum of korbanot. The prophet Zechariah, who is the prophet of the return, okay? He's the one who prophesies the return. He's the one who accompanies the returnees. Okay? The prophet Zechariah is the prophet of the return and the rebuilding. He says, Tzom HaRevi'i v'Tzom HaChamishi v'Tzom HaShevi'i v'Tzom HaAsiri. The fast of Tammuz, the fast of Tish'a BeAb, the fast of Gedaliah on the 3rd of Tishrei, and the fast of Asara B'Tevet, Yihiyu L'Sason U'Lesimcha Le'Bet Yehuda. They will be days of celebration for the house of Yehuda. What that means is, it's already way past 4 o'clock, sorry. What that means is, in the Second Temple era, the fasts were annulled. They were commemorated. We commemorated destruction. We kept destruction in our consciousness. We acknowledged that we are not free and clear from the possibility of future calamity, but we didn't fast in the Second Temple era. And that's because there had been a restoration, a reestablishment of Jewish sovereignty. Not what it was in the First Commonwealth, but still significant. Not insignificant. And that alone was worthy of altering the nature of the day. And I believe that in our days we can speak of a restoration, if not a partial restoration. 2 minutes. And that partial restoration is worthy of celebrating. It's even worthy of altering our relationship with Tish'a BeAb to one of a less intense form of mourning. We can welcome Talmud Torah, and we can even welcome Talmud Torah that brings us joy on Tish'a BeAb, because historically we've been in a place before where Tish'a BeAb warranted to not be so mournful.
Elders still cried in that generation.
The elders still cried. There was still a voice that cried. But the people, by the endorsement of the Navi, were allowed to celebrate, at least in the beginning. There was a subsequent deterioration. Midway through the Second Commonwealth, they started to fast again, because they understood that this ain't going to last, and that destruction would come again. But there is a precedent from the words of Zechariah, and I believe with a grain of salt, we can apply a parallel from then to now and explain why we have such positive forms of Torah study on Tish'a BeAb. And that's my final